Okay, while my colleagues are taking their places, I want to extend really my sincere thanks to Oleg Mozeletsky for putting such great panels. At first, I was taken aback by having so many people on one panel, but then I looked at the bios of all of the speakers that are speaking today, and I was literally blown away. They're incredible people with incredible biographies. I'm going to introduce them now. And then, by the way, at each panel. But I'm going to introduce my panel today. We are going to start with Paul Goebel, who is a senior fellow at the Jamestown Foundation. And he is also a longtime specialist on ethnic and religious questions in Eurasia. Paul has distinguished career working for the government, advising the State Department during the breakup of the Soviet Union, and now providing his insights about what is happening in Russia and what could happen in Russia in the future. Paul, thank you for being with us today. We have Paul?
Now I've unmuted.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Okay. It's a great pleasure to be here, and it's an even greater pleasure that such a meeting is taking place. Those of us who are old enough to remember in the years before the end of the Soviet Union know that there were not very many similar meetings then, because there was much less readiness to admit that the Soviet Union was about to come apart than there is now that the Russian Federation is headed to the dustbin of history. And I think that represents real progress. The problem is that there's a lot more progress that has to be made, and I think this is a very good place for us to start. I've given my paper to Margarita, and so I'm going to be very brief. Anyone who wants my fuller thoughts on this can get a copy from her.
We're going to publish it, Paul, on our website.
Right. Most people in the West today, unfortunately, still assume that the coming disintegration of the Russian Federation will be quick and easy, that it will be something like what happened in 1991, and that the West will be supportive, the Russians will be supportive, and the divisions within the Russian nation itself will not be important. None of those things are true. And I think we just have to come to terms with it. I'd like to focus on some part of that. I am absolutely convinced that what is coming will not be as quick, nor as easy, nor as bloodless as what we saw 30 years ago. In fact, it's likely to be far more complicated, last far longer, and require far more discipline and focus, not only by Western governments, but also by those who are in the emigration, and the need for them to have close contacts with the peoples of their homelands. I fear increasingly that what we are headed into is a period when the demise of the Russian Federation will resemble very much too much that of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th and early 20th centuries. For 100 years, the Ottoman Empire was known as the weak man of Europe, and it had a national revolution in the form of the Young Turks. But it also remained powerful enough throughout that entire period, not only to repress its own subjects, but to threaten the world. And I fear we have to be ready for that too now. I would love to see us take a much more forward policy, but my own experience in 1991 and subsequently suggests to me that's not very likely. Understanding why the events looming on the horizon are going to be so different and worse than those of 1991 is critical not only for the peoples involved and the strategies they adopt, but also, and perhaps especially, for outside governments, who are once again going to face a greater challenge than they did 3 decades ago, when all too many of them wanted to proclaim victory, the end of history, and assume that they would get a peace dividend from all this. The fact is that after a rupture occurs, whenever that is, the tasks ahead are going to be larger rather than less. Had we recognized that after 1991, we would not be having Putin, and Putin would not be in the Kremlin, and his war in Ukraine would not be going up. It wasn't, and so we are suffering as a result, as are the people of the region. What I'd like to do very quickly is to point out some of the reasons why the coming years are very much likely to be different from 1991. First of all, in 1991, almost everyone who did think the Soviet Union was coming apart agreed on the number of countries that would emerge and the borders they would have. There is absolutely no such agreement now, with range of options and the number of countries that we hope to see ranging from one, in the case of Vladimir Putin, to over 100 in the estimates of some people. That very fact means this is going to be very, very complicated and very, very explosive. Second, in my view at least, ethnicity is not going to be the primary factor. Far more important is going to be regionalism within the Russian nation. The biggest problem we have in talking about the future of this part of the world is that people don't address the fact that the Russian nation is itself a myth. The tragedy in this part of the world is that the Russians became an imperial state nation before they became a nation as a result. The Russians who live in Vladivostok, as opposed to the Russians who live in Königsberg, are as different as the Americans and the Australians. And we had better start figuring that out. But instead, we tend to ignore the regions within the Russian nation, and it's going to be those that will determine outcomes. Because if they do not matter, and that is the working assumption of an awful lot of people, then we will have a situation where the overwhelming Russian majority, led by a revanchist government, will engage in actions like Ukraine again and again. What is necessary to make the disintegration of the Russian Federation work is for the Russians themselves to come apart and form separate nations and separate countries. And talking about ethnic Russians may not be popular in a group of non-Russians, but unless we figure out what happens with the ethnic Russians, we're not going to achieve our goals, and we're certainly not going to have independence, or at least not for long. That's one of the mistakes that was made in 1991 and the years afterwards. We shouldn't make it again. Moreover, we need to remember that what's coming is not going to be even nominally within the terms of the legal framework of the Russian Federation. There is no right to secede in the Russian Federation Constitution. There was one in the Soviet one. That allowed the West to move as far towards supporting this process as it did. And we didn't move very far. One should not forget that the United States was 37th to recognize the recovery of independence by the three Baltic countries, and the United States Department of State kept the flag of the Soviet Union up 6 days after Boris Yeltsin took it down over the Kremlin and over the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. The idea that the West is going to come and support and create a tabula rasa that other people can then write on is simply not going to happen. And in 1991, we had a Russian leader in the person of Boris Yeltsin who was prepared to give up the periphery in order to get rid of the Soviet leadership of Gorbachev, mostly on the assumption that Yeltsin believed, and so did the people around him, that the periphery would come back because it had nowhere to go. There's not anyone now who thinks that Putin has that view or would adopt that kind of strategy. And that ally that the non-Russians had in the person of Boris Yeltsin simply isn't available in Moscow today. And that's going to make this process far difficult. My own view, and it's one I've written about many times over the last 20 years, is that what's coming is going to be that Russia is indeed a failed or failing state. But what is coming is going to be far more like what happened in 1918, when the state dissolved and then was reassembled by a newly mobilized central regime that was able to achieve what it did because the West provided just enough support for Moscow, for the Kremlin, to target the regions on the periphery as being handmaidens of outside powers, but not enough to allow them to win. There is an enormous danger. That's what Putin is trying to do. There is an enormous danger that will be repeated again and again, especially if those seeking independence in the future place their hopes in the West above all. It's going to have to be in your hands and in the hands of your peoples. And it's going to require that they adopt a much more long-term strategic approach than most of them have up to now. I think the danger that we will see a process of growth, of contraction, and then re-expansion, and then contraction again in the Russian case in the coming decades, just as we saw the efforts of the Ottomans to do the same in the absence of outside force. And it was a war. It took a war, World War I, to destroy the Ottoman Empire completely. And even then it didn't go all the way, because I would remind you that the largest nation on earth that doesn't have its own state are the Kurds. And they're not a state because of Turkey's position. This is going to mean that what we will see will be much more problematic. Now, those who want to help the non-Russians and the ethnic Russian regions to achieve independence, freedom, and democracy have got to do 3 to 5 things. First, the West needs to recognize that it made a terrible mistake in 1991 when it proclaimed just about everyone a Democrat and assumed that privatization of the economy would solve everything. I've often said that the greatest tragedy for the former Soviet space was the triumph of the University of Chicago economics department in Western thinking, the idea that economics would determine everything. Economics has done nothing to keep Putin from invading Ukraine. And that's something which, unfortunately, Western governments and Western analysts still don't understand. Second, for all the problems that the disintegration of the Russian Federation will involve, and those problems will be highlighted by all kinds of people in all kinds of Western governments that will argue we must do nothing because it would get worse, need to recognize that the only way forward to a peaceful world where democracy and freedom are possible for large numbers of people will be to dismantle the Russian Federation, the Russian state. And that means transforming the ethnic Russian myth into a variety of peoples, into a multitude of nations themselves. If we're not willing to do the things that will make that possible, then the future for many people is not going to be very good. Third, the West, and this goes to others as well, but must recognize that there's going to be some kind of Russian state at the end of all this. There are too many people who are happy today to put up maps that don't show any Russian state remaining. There's going to be one. It's probably going to be centered on Moscow. And it's going to be large enough and well-armed enough to create real problems for all or most of the others. That simply has to be understood. That is not an argument for not doing something. It is an argument for recognizing it and thinking about what is necessary to constrain that state so that it will be less likely to invade its neighbors. It will be less likely to repress its own people. Much of the discussion about what's happening now in the Russian Federation ignores that reality and somehow acts as if, well, if we can just have somebody better than Putin, or we can just have the non-Russians who are a third of the population go away, that will be enough. I promise you it won't. We should have learned that lesson in the last 30 years. Regrettably, we haven't. Fourth, and this is going to be the hardest thing for people in the West and especially the United States to recognize, the obligations and the challenges and the burdens that we are going to have to assume to make these kinds of things happen are going to be greater after this process starts than they are now. That means we have to view them as a long-term investment in a stable, peaceful, and democratic world. If we're not prepared to do that, then I fear we will probably cause more trouble and help fewer people. And finally, and this is something which I know a lot of non-Russians don't want to hear, it's absolutely essential that cooperation be promoted between various groups of Russians and the non-Russians, both in the areas where they live and more generally. The two silences between them are extremely dangerous. If there isn't that kind of cooperation, if there isn't a recognition that there are multiple Russias and there are many non-Russian nations that should become states, then it isn't going to be a good future for either of them. Now, as many of you know, I have long been and remain absolutely committed to the freedom and independence of all the peoples of what is now in the Russian Federation. I've said things that a lot of people don't like. In 1994, when I was asked in Latvia whether Latvia should be a member of NATO, my response was, no, the real question is whether Bryansk Oblast, next to Moscow, should be a member of NATO. I'm in favor of a very much more forward policy than we've ever adopted. But at the same time, on the basis of having been in this business for now 5 decades, I am also convinced that those of us who are involved must recognize just how difficult this is all going to be, rather than assuming that we are in a situation where by saying the right thing, convincing a few people to respond positively, everything is going to fall into our laps without difficulty. If we aren't willing to admit that and make the commitment required to make a difference, then there is a very great danger that we and those who that we and the peoples we want to hope may be dragged down into the dustbin of history along with the Russian Federation, which I am quite convinced is headed there. If not in this decade, then certainly in the coming ones. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We allocated a little bit more time for Paul to talk to you today because of his vast experience and his insights and kind of to set the frame for this discussion today. Now we're going to have a few less minutes for all of our next participants. So let's stick to 6 to 7 minutes at the most so that we can finish on time and allow the next panel to start on time. Our next speaker is Asset Abdullaeva. She is the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, founder of the Union of Chechen Youth in Quebec, Canada. Thank you, and thank you for coming here today from Canada. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank the organizers of this conference. It's a great honor for me to be here in Washington, and thank you for inviting me here. In 2002, when I was 11 years old, my mother, who is the people's artist of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, was invited to Moscow for an interview. She took me with her. When we arrived, the Russian journalist met us, and she looked at me and said to my mom, "Don't take the subway with your daughter." My mother was very surprised. She said, "Why?" And the journalist replied, "You are blonde, you look like Russian, but your daughter has the features of a person of Caucasian nationality. You might have problems with local militia. It means лицо кавказской национальности." And my mother was shocked. Years later, when I started to reflect upon the incident and the reaction of this journalist, I understood that her reaction was caused by phenomenon of Caucasophobia present among ethnic Russians and spread by Putin's policy of demonizing the Chechens. So I find it's important to understand the roots of the Chechen and Russian conflict. Historically, the relationship between Chechens and Russians has been characterized by the Russian willingness to use the overwhelming might to suppress the Chechens' will for self-determination. In fact, during the Great Caucasian War, the Chechens were represented by the image of a wicked Chechen who weds his dagger kin, as it is written by one of the greatest Russian poets, Lermontov, in his famous Cossack lullaby. During Soviet times, Stalin accused the entire nation for alleged support for Nazi invaders and deported the entire, all the population to Kazakhstan in Siberia, and labeled the Chechen people as enemy of the state, although it is a historic fact that Nazis, Germans, never reached Chechnya. So 50% of the population perished en route to Kazakhstan. In 1994, when Yeltsin launched a full-scale air and land attack on Chechnya, Yeltsin labeled the Chechen resistance, bandits, the regime as criminal, and the head of Chechen government, Johar Dudayev, as mad. Later, Putin portrayed Chechens as uniquely a criminal nation and Islamic terrorists. In fact, upon coming to power, he right away struck a chord with the Russian public by promising to waste all the terrorists in the outhouse. So the Chechen people are victims of Russian propaganda and are being used as a scarecrow to scare everyone away from the Chechen state. And the truth is that Russian imperialists, including Russian liberals, until this very moment support this narrative and deny the existence of the Chechen independent state. It is a fact that the Chechen independent state is a legitimate state as was USSR. The Declaration of State Sovereignty, adopted on 27 November 1990, was in full conformity with the USSR legislation. It is also a fact that in May 1992, the government of Johar Dudayev signed an agreement on the apportioning of weapons and military equipment with the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, Pavel Grachev. If Johar Dudayev had really come to power after an armed rebellion, as it is claimed by all Russian imperialists, including liberals, there would have been absolutely no question of transferring arms and military equipment to the government he headed. After the defeat in the First Russo-Chechen War, Russia recognized the sovereignty of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, de jure and de facto, concluding a peace treaty with Chechnya in May 1997, where both states were designated as subjects of the international law. Russian imperialists refused to admit that Russia committed war crimes in Chechnya. There is a lot of documented evidence about the fact that Russia's tactics in Chechnya were not in keeping with the Geneva Convention and its commitments to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Vacuum bombs, deliberate attacks on civilian populations, ethnic cleansing, torture, sweeps, everything has been used in Chechnya, which resulted in the death of 300,000 Chechen civilians, including my father, 42,000 children, and the death of democracy in Russia. In fact, Putin's rule has been synonymous with eradication of political opponents, anti-democratic reforms, suppression of free press, and demonization of Chechen people. Putin turned Russia into a unitary state and established autocracy with the Russian chauvinist imperialist ideology at the heart of his rule, which transformed into a form of fascism, one Führer, one Russia, and for Russians only. And this chauvinist imperialist ideology, until this very moment, is deeply admired by all Russian so-called liberals. By adopting the policy of appeasement, by tolerating Putin's narrative and accepting the black hole of lawlessness on the Russian side in Chechnya, the world, the West, has unfortunately raised a monster which is today threatening the entire world with a nuclear button. So what's next? How do we deal with this crisis in Eastern Europe? The West must realize that to achieve a long-term, substantial peace in the region, it can't just sweep Chechnya under the carpet as it has done for the past 30 years. Yes, the Soviet Union collapsed, but the evil empire did not fall apart precisely because the West convinced Ukraine to sign the 1994 memorandum and did not recognize the independence declared by Chechnya and Tatarstan. It's time for the West. And in fact, the West gonna commit the same mistake if it continue to listen to the Russian liberals who want to save the great Russian empire. It's time for the West to change its policy towards the occupied Chechen Republic of Ichkeria and Caucasus. It's time to follow the example of Ukraine and recognize the sovereignty of Chechen Republic of Ichkeria as Ukraine has done it on 18th October 2022. The Chechen government in exile is closely working with Ukrainian authorities and is willing to cooperate with the United States of America and the European Union. We need diplomatic and political support and financial support. Our capacities are very limited because we lack funds. We can't mobilize all our forces because we don't have financial means for that. I can assure you that the moment we receive support from the West, it won't find any better ally than the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria. Even Tolstoy said that Chechens are true friends and worst enemies. And we stand with United States of America, we stand with Ukraine. We value freedom as much as Americans do because we have been fighting for it desperately since 18th century. And I find it's amazing that today I can sit here in Washington and represent my country without being afraid that I will be killed or kidnapped as it happens in Russia when anyone dares to speak about the independent Chechen Republic of Ichkeria. The United States of America values freedom and democracy, and that is why we're looking forward to US cooperation. And finally, let's not forget that the defeat of Ukraine will be a disaster for the entire civilized world. It will be indeed the end of history, but not in Fukuyama's way. It will be the end of history where Goliath defeated David. The first president of Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, Johar Dudayev, warned the entire world about the disastrous consequences that the Russian Empire would bring if not stopped in Chechnya. Today, we can see that Russian Federation is igniting the sparks of terror all around the globe. And that's exactly what Johar Dudayev said. 30 years ago, the United States of America abandoned Chechnya. And the only wish I have today, now, may this never, never happen again. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I will move quickly to our next speaker, Shamil Albakov, who has a PowerPoint presentation. He is the Vice Minister Foreign Affairs of the Chechen Republic. He is the Vice Chair of the Committee for North Caucasus Nations, and he's also Honorary Consul of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria in France. So he is going to be presenting on his organization.
Thank you.
The PowerPoint already.
The PowerPoint, please.
Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm proud that there is an important delegation of our committee here. Asset, myself, Iyad Yugar, Cherkashin in USA, and our chairman, Captain Adel Bashkawi, who is also Cherkashin and vice chairman of our committee, and many guests here representing the Cherkashin diaspora in USA and the Chechen diaspora. Your presence here is a testament that we didn't surrender and that we will continue our struggle for the independence. I will limit my speech explaining 7 points of our strategy. So the first point is the necessity to support Ukraine. The government of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, led by Ahmad Zakayev, and our committee started from the first day of the Russian aggression to support Ukraine in all the spheres, defense, politically, in the media, by every means that we have. So we are appealing here to the Congress of USA to continue to support the Ukraine because it's vitally necessary to continue to help the Ukrainian resist the Russian aggression. It is needed for Ukraine, for the North Caucasus, and for all the civilized world. The second point is the defense of the North Caucasus. It consists in the creation of the North Caucasian Army in Ukraine. While Russia is becoming more uncontrollable, genocides and wars against the population of the North Caucasus are possible again. persecutions and murdering of hundreds of activists are going on in North Caucasus now. In Ukraine, the Prime Minister of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, Ahmed Zakayev, managed to form the army of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria. And we must do all we can to obtain necessary support to advance that process. This army has double function: helping Ukrainians to resist Russian aggression and prepare to the liberation of the North Caucasian territories. Every day, the Chechen army becomes a real modern army, legal, internationally recognized, trained, respecting all the conventions, respecting the Convention of Geneva, coordinating its actions with the Ukrainian army and all our political partners. And when the time comes, that army, those combatants, will be ready to protect the population of the North Caucasus from Russian aggression and will assure stability and peace in the region. The third point is the necessity of creation of an international media platform for information for all the North Caucasus nations. News, discussions, analyses, culture, broadcasts about the different languages of the North Caucasus and other content is necessary. The Russian opposition has many effective media platforms, while we have very little media. They don't accept our struggle for freedom. They just want us to stay in the Russia of in the Russia of their dreams. They don't accept our struggle for independence. But we don't want the false Russian Federation and its FSB methods, neither the so-called new beautiful Russia of their dreams. So we have two propaganda sources working against us: the Russian state propaganda and the propaganda of the Russian opposition. So we are very concerned by this point, and we need support to have a media, efficient media, to work in that direction. We are more than able to establish independent states and form in the future a confederation of North Caucasian nations like the European Union. That is the mission of our generation now and of the generation of our children. And the media is the most important tool to help achieve it. The fourth point is establishing political alliances. We are working on establishing political alliances between Western countries and the government of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria in exile and our North Caucasus Nations Committee. This work started in Ukraine, and we need other countries to join that process. It is in the interest of our people and in the interest of Ukraine, as well as Europe and USA, that the North Caucasus becomes free and able to form a civilized region of prosperity and development. Built on the principles of democracy, it will open many possibilities for the world economy, investments, resources, transport facilities, trade, military alliances. The fifth point of our strategy, we ask and we demand the recognition of the genocides and the condemnation of the continuing systematic crimes committed by Russia against Chechens, Ingush, Circassians, and the other people of the North Caucasus. And that was committed, all these crimes were committed throughout the history of Russia, throughout the three periods of Russian history: the Tsarist period, the Soviet period, and the so-called Russian Federation period. The Ukraine has already recognized and condemned the genocide of Chechens and Ingush. The resolution of recognition and condemning the genocide of Circassians is in preparation. And we want the other countries to join this process. In 2018, the government of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria sent a document listing all the crime of aggression, the war crimes and the crimes against humanity to the International Court of The Hague, Criminal Court of The Hague. But the absence of political will and the fear of Russia caused a total ignoring of this document by the International Court, and that must change. The sixth point, we are working on the preparation of economical scenarios of development of our region. And it's important for us to have experts and experienced politicians to join us in that work. Finally, the seventh point, we would like to alert everyone. Russia threatened the world with nuclear arms, then with the energies, gas and oil, then blocking the export of Ukrainian cereals. And now they are using again extremism and terrorism to threaten the world, trying to stop the support for Ukraine. We are working every day on the social networks and with our diasporas, alerting our people not to follow the manipulations of Russian proxies using religion. Islam has its place in our society, and it is a religion of peace and progress. And we are successfully providing our people with the peaceful, true, and civilized knowledge of our religion. The free North Caucasus will not represent any threat to the world. To the contrary, it will be a region of stability and modernization, and a model of multi-ethnic and multi-faith states respecting different religions, different traditions, respecting the human rights, and doing all in favor of development and prosperity. We are sure that in all these points, we have common interests, and we ask you to work with us, and so the independence, freedom, and the development of the North Caucasus will be achieved. Many thanks to the organizers of this conference, to the Jamestown Foundation and the Forum of Post-Russia, of the Free People of Post-Russia, for the possibility to address directly here in USA, in Washington, D.C., all our partners and friends, and to present our struggle for the independence to the American society. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. I will turn now to Batyr Boromangnaev, who is chairman of the Congress of Oirat Kalmyk people and also a member of the Free Nations League. Thank you.
Good morning. I am glad to welcome to the participants of our conference. We are at the entrance to a new geopolitical era. The reasons for this include not only corporate strategies, new scientific discoveries and technologies, artificial intelligence and climate change, but also the unreasonable ambitions of the leader and the people supporting him in a country that has become a banal victim of mass anger, self-indulgence, resentment, and the desire of revenge. My name is Batyr Boromangnaev. I am the chairman of the representative body of my nation, the Congress of Oirat Kalmyk people, and I'm a member of Free Nations League. For the last 35 years, I have been professionally engaged in politics, as well as in public investment, human rights, party activities, business, teaching, historical education, etc. As it turned out, in the conditions of Russia, practically everything I was engaged in, except politics, was politics, pure, underground, or official. And today I will talk about what I have been engaged in politics for these 35 years. Dreams that the Oirat Kalmyk people could become the owners of their own independent state was born in the earlier 1990s. But after Putin's arrival, people's consciousness became infected with thoughts of a great Russia, not Kalmykia. Gradually, people began to realize that it is impossible to preserve their culture, traditions, language, their ethnicity, or simply to develop in this criminal Russian state. It is a reverie, self-deception, and utopia. Either our people and other peoples will sooner or later be eaten up by purposeful assimilation, or they will be killed by obedient service to the Moscow homeland. This is exactly what is happening in the case of Russia's war against Ukraine. Tens of thousands of people from among non-Russian peoples are sent in the interests of Putin and the Russian Empire to commit war, crimes, and death. The alternative and the only guarantee of liquidation of a threat not only to the peoples living within Russian state, but also to all mankind is a termination of existence of Russia and creation of independent states on this post-Russian territory. I must say my people have had several independent states in the past. Now, I just want to list what an independent Oirat Kalmykia would be and what benefits it would bring to United States, Europe, Ukraine, and the whole world. Oirat Kalmykia has a favorable position in many respects and is part of several historical, natural, geopolitical, cultural, economic areas and macro regions at the same time. Territory of the Republic Kalmykia is part of the Black Sea, Caspian macro region and the northern Caspian Sea. It has a long coastline of the Caspian Sea with a shallow shelf, located within the Caspian oil and gas province. Estimated hydrocarbon reserves are about 20 billion tons of fuel equivalent. It occupies a transit position on the north-south, Russia, Transcaucasia, Iran, and east-west, Central Asia, Ukraine. Trade routes and may become part of the bridge between Europe and Central Asia. It's located on the path of the shortest air routes between Europe and East and Southeast Asia. This is territory through which a significant part of the Caspian Oil Pipeline Consortium passes, which annually pumps about 70 million tons of oil from Kazakhstan and southern Russia to terminals in the Black Sea. It could be used as a route for new oil pipelines from the Caspian Sea to Ukraine and further to Europe. Can be used for fiber optic routes and the information traffic from Europe to Asia. May be of interest for the diplomatic, economic, and military presence of the United States, European Union, NATO in the Caspian Basin area. This is a small part of what I would like to say, I'm ready to talk about it in more details, as I have a lot more to discuss on the topic. Welcome to our independent oil at Kalmykia, to all our friends. Thank you.
Thank you, but it's so important to stress the economic opportunities and potential of those regions and how they can sustain themselves if and when they become independent. I would like to invite now Vasilina Orlova with her online presentation, online talk. Vasilina is anthropologist. She's at the University of Texas here in the United States. She studies Siberia, post-Soviet ruins, immobility and potency and toxicity of Soviet effect. Thank you, Vasilina, for being with us today. Is she here? She's there, right? Can you hear us, Vasilina? I don't think we have her. All right. Then we have Yuri Terehov, who is at Fletcher School. He's a visiting scholar at the Fletcher School at Tufts University right now. Otherwise, he's a political analyst and media manager. He's also going to speak to us online. Yuri.
Good afternoon, good morning in Washington, D.C. Thank you for inviting me to speak at your conference. I'm sorry for not being in D.C. These days. So I don't claim to represent any particular region or nation here right now, but I want to share with you my recent research on the crisis of Russian nation building, Russian nationhood that I did during my stay at the Fletcher School recently, and hopefully it's going to be published in full soon. When we hear Putin's assertion that Russian borders do not end, are we compelled to ask, is it merely rhetoric or reflection of a deeper truth? In light of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, questions about the essence of Russia's identity surface, urging us to scrutinize its social and political landscape more closely. This examination challenges the conventional notion of Russia as a unified political entity, and here I totally agree with Mr. Gobel. Therefore, it becomes imperative for us to reassess conventional perspectives on Russian identity and explore alternative pathways forward. Through this exploration, we aim not only to grasp the tapestry of Russia's reality, but also to pave the way towards a sustainable peace. Let's embark on the brief exploration of nationhood and the process of nation building, considering whether Russia's experience aligns with established theoretical paradigms. Benedict Anderson's seminal work, Imagined Communities, provides a valuable framework for understanding nations as imagined political communities. Anderson's insights underscore the pivotal role of collective imagination in fostering a sense of belonging among diverse populations, challenging the notion of nations as fixed entities and highlighting their constructed nature. However, the conventional dichotomy between civic and ethnic nationalism put forward by the scholars like Michael Ignatieff fell short of encapsulating the complexities of national identities. Ignatieff's advocacy, for example, for good civic nationalism over bad ethnic nationalism oversimplifies the intricate processes of identity formation, particularly within culturally diverse contexts like Russia. There in Russia, the government has often utilized such distinctions to quell dissent within breakaway regions like Chechnya and to justify aggressive actions against neighboring states. Instead, scholars like Will Kimlicka or Gregory Yuzdanis advocate for a more holistic approach that integrates cultural dimensions and political representation into the fabric of nation-building endeavors. The historical trajectory of nation-building in Russia reveals a complex interplay of imperial aspirations and autocratic rule. As noted by British historian Geoffrey Hosking, the omnipresence of monarchy inhibited the emergence of cohesive nation state, perpetuating a political landscape marked by autocracy and stagnation. Attempts by the emperor, for example, Nicholas I, to co-opt the concept of nationality as a metaphysical bond between the ruler and the people further impeded the development of representative governance, essential for modern nationhood. Furthermore, Russia's expansive territorial conquests and militaristic culture have profoundly influenced its historical development. Research by Russian historian Alexander Etkind sheds light on how the Russian Empire's expansion contributed to the colonization of various ethnic groups and the assimilation of ethnic Russians in its core, shaping Russia's relationships with its subject. The term Russian itself has undergone significant evolution, reflecting shifts in rulers' vision and political contexts. As we navigate through these historical and theoretical insights, it becomes, in my view, evident that Russia's identity is far from monolithic. Its complex tapestry of cultures, histories, and political dynamics necessitate a nuanced understanding and a re-evaluation of traditional paradigms. By embracing this complexity, we can chart a course toward a more inclusive and peaceful future, not just only for post-Russia, but for the broader international community. And as we delve deeper into the complexities of Russian identity and nation building, we confront contemporary challenges of imperialist legacy and the rise of Putinism. The confusion of nationalist fervor and imperial nostalgia underscores the task of navigating divergent ideologies in today's Russia. While Putinism's stronghold rests on notions of national greatness and post-Soviet resentment, it faces opposition from the ethnic minorities and alternative forms of Russian nationalism that challenge the state's hegemonic narrative. The task of redefining Russian identity amidst historical this baggage and present-day hurdles represent a formidable yet imperative task. Unlike the trajectories of many European nations, Russia's journey toward a unified national identity has been marked by deviations. Under Putin's regime, this paradigm rooted in statist imperialism has supplanted the notion of modern political nation, limiting Russian identity to adherence to the state agenda rather than individual self-identification, roots, or cultural affiliations. It begs the urgent question: can Russian nation building pivot toward alternative, non-authoritarian foundations, thereby fundamentally reshaping the continent? Alexander Etkin's recent book, Russia Against Modernity, casts light on Russia's struggle against progress, highlighting its reliance on fossil fuels and exacerbation of social inequality. Etkin foresees potential scenarios for decolonization, or as he calls it, defederalization, suggesting that Russia may face fragmentation, but potentially giving rise to self-sufficient and probably successful entities. However, the realization of such scenarios hinges on the cultivation of a coherent narrative and new national identities. Without this, these potential transformations may remain elusive or exacerbate existing grievances. To avert further resentment after the breakup of the Russian Federation, it is imperative to empower communities seeking the empire-less future and the establishment of their respective national homes, including those for ethnic Russians. One avenue for defining the identity of ethnic Russians lies in, for example, Ilya Lazarenko's vision of a Russian nation-state, Velikoressia or Zalesia. Such a state would encompass some regions in the Russian ethnocultural core in European Russia. This approach aims to provide ethnic Russians, or whatever they choose to call themselves, with a home defined by clear boundaries and historical cultural foundations, countering the expansionist rhetoric prevalent in Moscow's discourse while following a Euro-authentic path. The unique experiences of regions like my own northern homeland, Pomoria, may serve as exemplars for the redefinition of nationhood on new grounds. by prioritizing local and regional identities and nurturing a sense of rooted cosmopolitanism, pro-democracy civil society groups can counterbalance the Kremlin's homogenizing narrative, fostering a modern national identity rooted in the rich diversity of their respective cultures. The empowerment of grassroots resistance, the preservation and celebration of local heritage, and the advocacy for decolonization represent, in my view, promising avenues for reimagining post-Russian identity beyond authoritarian and imperial legacies. Though this path may be bumpy, I know this, but the rewards of charting a new course are boundless, and it falls upon us to take the first step. Thank you. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much, Yuri. And now we have our last speaker for this panel, Noma Zarubina, who is an anti-war activist, a researcher of Central Asia and information warfare in post-Soviet states. She was also an NGO representative at the United Nations Economic and Social Council in the past. She lives in New York. Thank you very much, Noma, for being with us today.
Thank you, Margarita, and good morning, dear colleagues. I was born and raised in Western Siberia in Tomsk, and today I want to raise awareness about several things related to Western Siberia. This include, of course, the region's natural resources, scientific and cultural heritage, and the impact of propaganda on the younger generation in Siberia through different tools, first of all, through universities and specific youth forums. In addition, I want to draw attention to students from post-Soviet states. If you follow specific news about higher education in Russia, Russia issued the most significant number of higher education quotas this year for foreign students, not only from post-Soviet territories, but from other countries as well. But however, we all have to understand that actual motive behind the Kremlin's offer is not to promote some scientific cooperation between states and regions, but to re-educate or educate young specialists with current Russian political standards. They aim to make young students, first of all, ideologically, but also financially and socially dependent on pro-Kremlin narratives and Kremlin-controlled institutions. And Tomsk has become a popular destination for international students who are often recruited for pro-Kremlin projects under the appearance of education initiatives. This is part of a larger strategy by the government security services to create a network of groups that are loyal or can be loyal in the near future to the Kremlin. University administration are often involved in such collaborations, which aim to engage young professionals for political objectives in Russia. So dictatorships often manipulate young people at forums and conferences to secure their future power. The Kremlin uses students and researchers as tools for current and future propaganda efforts. Also, Tomsk possesses a cultural and scientific heritage of global value, including its wooden historical architecture. Unfortunately, we cannot restore many wooden buildings in Tomsk because our architecture is not an economic priority for the Kremlin and for the local authorities as well. In the near future, we can lose this heritage. So the history of scientific centers in Siberia is shadowed by pain due to political repressions from the past and the practice of exiling highly educated individuals to Siberia in previous centuries. Just some historical facts. So how we all know, thousands of people were imprisoned, murdered, and tortured in labor camps in Siberia, especially until 1953. In the past, Soviet authorities masked places where thousands of people were murdered. As an example, Kolpashevsky Yar. This is a big grave with people who were shot and hidden by their own authorities. However, the truth was hidden only until 1979, when part of the bank of the Ob River collapsed, exposing the brutal reality of the past for people. But even after this discovery, the authorities tried to hide this event again. A large number of individuals living in Siberia don't know about such essential stories about our region, because such stories are never included in our school programs. The significant state control in Russia has led to the banning of non-profit organizations, such as NGO Memorial, for example, which advocates for the rights of victims of Russian repression. The Kremlin has been using the manipulation of people's memories as one of its most effective tools. It's a fact that most people are not aware of the dark side of the Soviet history and about the current situation in Russia. In other words, we don't know who we are. The gradual influence of disinformation on the younger generation can lead to specific consequences. First of all, this is aggression towards some nations, mainly European and North American countries. It can also lead to an inclination towards conspiracy theories and a tendency to constantly perceive the United States in a negative light after being educated in Russian institutions. Russia's leadership seems exclusively focused on its own interest while exploiting other regions to satisfy its own desires. People in Siberia fail to recognize the significance of local heritage and the richness of Siberian land. As a result, we are missing out on huge opportunities for success in tourism. Many Americans ask me when we can go to Siberia, when we can travel to Siberia to see the real Siberian winter, to feel the real Siberian vibe. But my answer is always, I don't know, because I'm afraid to go home. And I think you're afraid to go to Russia too, because of politics. Moscow's leadership has developed a long-term plan to exploit the resources, but also population of Siberia. Moscow heavily relies on natural resources from Siberia, such as wood, coal, gas, oil, diamonds. Using this money, the Kremlin has brutally continuing attacking Ukraine for more than 2 years already. Western Siberia is a hostage of Kremlin's desire to increase its wealth and power. When we free ourselves from Moscow's control, we can gain a deeper understanding, first of all, of our history, unlock our full potential of the region, invest in the growth of our region, and have the freedom to be ourselves. So, and I just want to conclude my speech with a citation from Financial Times, which is, "What happens in Siberia matters to the rest of the world." Very short and very true. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nama. And we will continue with the topic about Siberia. We have 6 more minutes left. Vasilina, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. The topic of our panel is captive nations and captive regions. Just yesterday, the news went viral of the dwellers of Orenburg Oblast in Russia who cooperated to block the water from raising and flooding their homes. Earlier, a dam in Orenburg broke. The people came together to create a dam that prevented the Ural River from inflicting further damage, in addition to the damage that the flood already caused in Orsk and Orenburg. The people built a new dam by themselves without the help from the government. Doing things by themselves without the help of structures that were supposed to be there becomes the only form of self-government in Russia that can protect the people from the natural disasters. The government abandoned the people as whatever means and resources the government has. The government directs to the Russian unlawful war of colonial aggression and genocidal land grab in Ukraine. The notion of captive nations and captive regions represents the Orenburg Oblast in Russia, even if not everybody there might agree. The Russian government has been touting the vertical of power, a notion invented by Vyacheslav Surkov, as a way to justify the uber-centralization along with such notions as sovereign democracy and stability. Everyone can see now that stability was not as stable as it appeared. If anything, the stability of extraction, impoverishment, and depopulation is the stability that Moscow regime is offering to the nations and regions that are currently loosely united by the name of the Russian Federation and a broader notion of the Russian world. The vertical of power is extremely rigid, and the central government habitually adopted an extremely extractivist approach to the regions. During my anthropological fieldworks in eastern Siberia, I often heard that people complained. And they related the feelings of abandonment, the feeling of abandonment by the central power, the feeling of extractivist approach of Moscow's government. Those were prominent. These feelings were betraying the expectations of a paternalistic government, which comes as no surprise to anyone who observed the video messages recorded by Russians of the content "Putin help us." One of such videos was even recorded in Orenburg Oblast during the recent flood as a result of the broken dam. Looking at such expressions of expectations from the government and a demonstrated loyalty to the government, one could ask if our hopes for self-directedness and local governments are futile. However, the voices of the local intelligentsia, regional intelligentsia, the elites of the national republics, which we hear at these forums, the forums of the free nations of post-Russia, are not to be dismissed. These voices must be heard and appreciated, and one of the reasons why we hear them outside of Russia more often than coming from Russia is because such speakers are being labeled extremists and terrorists in Russia. They are silenced and imprisoned. These people are doing everything that depends on them to build connections with the allies in the West, in the East, and in Africa. They expand our understanding of colonialism to include Russia as one of the colonial powers. The tasks of the Russians, or at least the way I see it, is not to publish memoirs titled Patriot, as the widow of Navalny announced Navalny's memoir is going to be titled, but in supporting Ukraine and the national liberations movements. The work in Russian by an ethnic Russian that could be worthy of attention will be titled National Traitor. Russia needs to be decentralized, and the Moscow regime needs to lose the ability to gather vehicles and manpower throughout Eurasia for its colonial pursuits, inspired by the vengeful desire to reattribute Kiev as the capital of the Kievan Rus and the cradle of the Russian civilization to the current Russian Federation. The recollections of Rurik and other myths of the Russian statehoods can happen in interviews, but they cannot be the ground of such wild revisionism as Russia is currently attempting. I hope the world may come together once again, together with China and the global South, to denounce the violent unilateral revision of sovereign borders in support of Ukraine's heroic fight and in support of liberation and decentralization movements in Russia. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Vasilina. Thank you, everyone, and on this wonderful panel. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions, but we are going to be here all day, and you are going to be able to ask our panelists questions in the meantime, and also during other panels. Please direct your questions to these panelists as well. Don't limit to one panel only. Thank you. We are switching now to the next panel. Another 8 participants here with their take on their own aspirations for independence or more freedom. And our moderator is going to be Taras Gvitov.